As Baha'is, of course, we study what Baha'u'llah said. And then there's a challenge that we face where, over time, the more we study, we begin to think that we understand what Baha'u'llah said. But we also have to understand that there's a difference between what he said and what we think he said. Now, the thing about it is that if you ask yourself, well, you don't see the difference. It's natural, because if you saw a difference, you'd change your mind. If you say, oh, he thinks this, okay, I think that too. So I would change my mind to match, but nevertheless, no matter how sure I am that I understand it, I have to also be aware that there's a gap between what my understanding is and what Baha'u'llah is actually saying. There's a book by journalist Will Storr called The Unpersuadables, where he looks into this idea of how human beings understand things. He does a series of interviews with people who, let's say, they believe strongly in things that are considered to be maybe on the fringes of human knowledge, or maybe actually outside the circle of human knowledge. So, for example, UFOs, or past life regression, or ghosts, or creationism, or yoga healing, and so on. And he looks at these individuals and he interviews them, and he sees that, well, they sincerely believe what they're talking about. And yet, the more you try to point out any kind of contradiction in what they believe, well, they're unpersuaded by that. But then, as he explored more, he also saw that those people who mobilize themselves against thinkers like that, people who would try to debunk psychic phenomena, or new atheists who would try to, critique religion, that actually this same phenomena of mind was also apparent there as well. That there was just a tendency of human beings to try to understand reality and then become convinced about what they believed. So he talks about this idea. He said, I look at myself and I say that I look at my beliefs and I think that, well, what I believe is pretty much right. Everything I think, I can't think of anything that I believe that is wrong. And so I look around, I think, yes, that's okay. But then I think, well, I look around me, and then I see, well, this guy's wrong about that. This person over here is wrong about that. It's fairly easy to look around and see the problems other people have with understanding reality. And then he said, but then, well, what does that mean? Does that mean I have some kind of superpower where I'm able to understand reality and other people are not, and so on? So then you have to start saying, well, actually, probably some of the things I think must be wrong. But then I go down the list and I say, is this wrong? No, that's right. What about this? No, that's pretty good too. And so on down the list, I can't find anything that's wrong. And he said that this tendency begins to manifest itself on a cultural level. He said, I've watched as people have honed in on their beliefs and then engaged in battles across the lines with others who have their different set of beliefs. I've watched these personal battles be manifested in the wider world. The decade of terrorism we've just lived through has its roots, of course, in mismatched beliefs that are both political and religious. Those same years saw what the appearance of an increasing suspicion of science. He said one response has been the cultural rise of the radicalized rationalists, celebrity atheists who have written best-selling books and sponsored anti-God advertising on the sides of London buses, groups of self-declared skeptics who toured sold-out concert venues like rock stars, defining themselves in opposition to the kinds of anti-scientific thinking that they declared dangerous. Every one of these people convinced they're right, none of them convincing the other. So there's a problem of human understanding and the general tendency of human beings to look at the world and have the sense that they understand it. And then, unfortunately, to become somewhat impervious to any attempt to try to understand reality in a different way. So, again, I'm sure not in Canada. Everybody's quite civil here, right? But I can speak for the United States. And the public discourse is breaking down. Not just ordinary discourse, not just comments at the bottom of articles on the internet, although watch out if you read those, but even the public affairs, the impossibility of governing when people decide that they know what's right and they're not going to accept the view of anybody else. Now, the question becomes, how do you apply this also on the level of academic work? Because in some areas, the idea is that, well, the way to find truth is to argue. And so people just throw their ideas out there and they argue as strenuously as possible and so on, and the best ideas win out. And now, to some extent, that's true in the area of the hard sciences, because in the final analysis, you have the facts of physical reality to check this discussion against. But in other human disciplines, there's a price that's paid for that. Now, friends, we know from what Baha'u'llah said that there is a mode of consultation that's not about decision-making. It's about just the general idea of investigating reality. Baha'u'llah tells us to take counsel together in all matters, inasmuch as consultation is the lamp of guidance which leadeth the way and is the bestower of understanding. The writings also tell us that the maturity of the gift of understanding is made manifest through consultation. So we have a set of a methodology, basically, the process of consultation, where individuals, whatever level of understanding they have, are free to understand that and hold their views and express their views, but also are aware that maybe their views are not right, maybe they're not absolutely correct, but they're offered, and then in a process where other views are shared, gradually, if individuals don't stubbornly cling to their opinion, gradually the truth starts to appear. And then a new consensus emerges. Now, in the writings, we have a number of statements that remind us that the search that we're engaged in is something that transcends extremes or dichotomies, the tendencies to go into a dichotomy and fight it out. So, for example, Baha'u'llah says, "Know then that whosoever adhereth to the outward meaning while oblivious to the inward meaning is of the ignorant. That whosoever adhereth to the inward meaning while oblivious to the outward meaning is of the heedless. And that whosoever understandeth the inward meaning in the light of the outward meaning is of the truly learned." So our tendency to go to one extreme or the other, but he's calling us to rise above those limited perspectives. Abdu'l-Baha, of course, talks about the idea of science and religion are the two wings with which man's intelligence can soar into the heights and with which the human soul can progress. Should a man try to fly with the wing of religion alone, he would quickly fall into the quagmire of superstition. Whilst on the other hand, the wing of science alone, he would also make no progress, but fall into this despairing slough of materialism. So it takes both. It's not one extreme, it's not the other. Somehow we have to find the balance that transcends. It's not just somewhere in the middle. And Shoghi Effendi, of course, talked about this in relation to the progress of the faith. He says it's our primary task to keep the most vigilant eye on the manner and character of its growth, to combat effectively the forces of separatism and sectarian tendencies, lest extreme orthodoxy on the one hand and irresponsible freedom on the other cause it to deviate from that straight path which alone can lead to its success. So our effort must be not to be caught up in these limited perceptions of understanding where we end up creating dichotomies and fighting about two sides, rather than trying to draw the insights that are necessary and that we can retain in a gradual and constructive, deeper understanding of reality that empowers us to contribute to the advancement of a new civilization. Now, another point I want to raise, friends, is the concept of the scope that we have for our differing opinions. Because sometimes then we get the idea then consultation means we all have to agree. So in a way, it's a way of kind of silencing diversity of thought. And in fact, that's not the case. Even though we know that to some extent, based on what I said before, of course, maybe you're not convinced yet about yourself, but we all know that to some extent, what we understand must be, to some degree, not correct. So if we say, well, nobody can express themselves unless they express themselves absolutely correctly, well, then that would mean nobody could express themselves. So we have to put forward our views, and we have to welcome the views of others, and we shouldn't suppress those views. And we should create an environment where the friends feel that they could put forward their ideas. Then, for example, we recall the historical situation where the Baha'is in the early days had a divided view of Baha'u'llah's station. Some believed him to be the supreme manifestation of God, and others went further than that. And what did Baha'u'llah tell them? He said, well, they could have their own ideas as long as they didn't argue about them. And Abdul Baha said that if two souls quarrel and contend about a question of the divine questions, differing and disputing, then both are wrong. The wisdom of this incontrovertible law of God is this, that between two souls from among the believers of God, no contention and dispute might arise, that they may speak with each other with infinite amity and love. So we have the right balance for it. Everybody should be free to express their views. We shouldn't contend with each other because of our views. Gradually then, in the sharing of ideas, the truth will gradually emerge. We'll be able to find it. Now, sometimes in our use of vocabulary also, we tend to impinge a little bit on this exchange of ideas. For example, we should keep in mind, for example, that while we're told not to criticize one another, that doesn't mean we're not supposed to use critical thought. You see, those two things are not the same thing. We shouldn't conflate them. Although there might be a dissenting idea expressed, the idea that doesn't hold with the traditional idea, with the majority idea, that's different than the concept of dissension, of which there's no place, or dissenting against the revelation, which of course is a contradiction of what it means to be a Baha'i. In sharing our views, we have to learn how to appreciate all the factors that Baha'u'llah told us about the dangers of speech. So, for example, excess of speech is a deadly poison. All right? Abdul Baha says, to insist that we are right and others are wrong is the greatest obstacle to unity and truth. So, what we're trying to do then is raise a community where this kind of discussion can take place and sharing of views. So we want as a harmony, like in other areas of our work, we want a harmony among the individuals in community and institutions. So we want individuals who are free to investigate and explore ideas and share those ideas. And we want a community that's tolerant to some degree, that's willing to listen, that hears, but also is not carried away by new ideas, or that their faith becomes shaken when certain ideas that they didn't understand are presented, which might not be correct in the first place. The institutions themselves also have to have a degree of tolerance to give the freedom for ideas to emerge, but at the same time also has to protect the community from extremes. All we have to do is keep in mind that when we're talking about that there's some kind of relationship there, We don't mean creationism. We're not talking about scholasticism. We're not talking about theological schools in which sciences are just the handmaiden of theology. At the same time, we're not talking about the other extreme either. We're not talking about scientism. We're not talking about religious studies, reductionism of religion. We're not talking about materialism, philosophical materialism. So we have to recognize that this is our condition at this stage in the development of the faith. Human minds are limited. In science, advancement is made because there's a truth referent that's higher than the conclusions of the individual human mind. There's the brute facts of nature against which the ideas are tested through the scientific method. And the reliability of science is based on the extent that it can be grounded on these brute facts rather than personal impressions. And so in the same way, the revelation represents a kind of a truth referent against which human conceptions have to be weighed. So in principle, the idea is that the individual has to bend to revelation. We don't bend revelation to ourselves, to our own thoughts and conceptions. And so the teachings and their authoritative interpretations are statements of truth that can't be altered. But at the same time, we have to struggle to understand what they mean and to bring our own personal conceptions closer and closer to that understanding. And that's just not about study, but it's also about testing those ideas in action in the field. So what we have to do then is to make sure that our Baha'i discourse in our investigation doesn't become about this, that it's about the search for truth, not claiming that what I've found is true, and therefore I try to bend the faith to my point of view, and I insist, and I go about trying to convince the other Baha'is to agree with me, rather than just putting my ideas out there and seeing if there's a value in them, contributing them to the consultative process and so on. Now, the first line of defense in this process are Baha'i intellectuals themselves. You see, what we need, we can't have the institutions becoming the bulwark of defending the faith in these areas. It has to be the Baha'is in the diverse fields who can think, who can study, who can understand this plan tomorrow to look at across the diverse fields and see how do they tick, how do they work. What we need, for example, are Baha'is in different fields to tell us the strengths and weaknesses of those fields. What are the best methods? How do they understand reality? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of those methods for understanding the teachings? We don't need somebody to say, for example, I'm a historian, this is what I say about Baha'i history, therefore I'm the authority, so it's true, and therefore you all have to accept it. It's quite the opposite. What we need is a Baha'i historian who will tell us what are the strengths and weaknesses of the methods in the field of history. How reliable are they? What insights do they help us to share? And in what ways can we understand that they might lead to misunderstandings about the nature of history? And so the same thing is true with Baha'is in every field of endeavor.